Morning, everyone. It's sort of encouraging to hear about sort of some of the things which people have been saying this morning, just thinking about how it sort of ties in with what Rob's been talking to us about, taking the church from our building and going out. So sort of hearing about the food pantry going off to judge some courgettes or some Victoria sponge cake or whatever it may be. Seeing our new Morrison's manager, or so he likes to think, in the local paper. And I sort of just want to talk a little bit sort of more along the lines of sort of that continuation, sort of looking at sort of moving out of the building. The last couple of weeks, I've been listening to the different seminars and talks from the Elim Leadership Summit that Rob and Debbie were at a couple of weeks ago, and just sort of beginning to understand and to realise, what Rob's heart is, and to sort of see how what was happening at the Leadership Summit ties in with what Rob's vision is and what Rob's heart is for the church. And one of the things which people would sort of kept talking about during the different seminars, and what I'm sort of going to be looking at today, is along the lines of oppression. So not really a happy subject. But we need to realise that as we step up and as we go out, we are going to face oppression. We're going to be opposed by the devil because he's not going to enjoy what we are doing. And so I want to look a little bit at Peter this morning, this guy who eventually sort of stepped up and stepped out of faith, became the founding father, if you like, of the church after Jesus. But also he experiences oppression. And in fact, he writes a whole book about oppression and Christians who are being oppressed and having to flee. We look back at Peter, where he started from. The first time we see Peter is in the book of Matthew, chapter 4, verse 18 to 20. It says, "One day as Jesus was walking along the shore of the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, also called Peter, and Andrew, throwing a net into the water, for they fished for a living. Jesus called out to them, 'Come, follow me, and I will show you how to fish for people.' And they left their nets at once and followed him." So our first image of Peter isn't some great prophet, isn't a leader of the synagogue. It's a simple fisherman, a job where he wouldn't have needed, degrees or sort of a high level of training. And we see that he was in a town on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, miles away from Jerusalem, the center of Israel. And yet this simple fisherman from the middle of nowhere, really, goes on to become one of Jesus' disciples and goes on to start the modern church as we know it. Despite being with Jesus, though, despite spending all this time with Jesus, these 3 years with Jesus, it's encouraging for us to know that Peter mucked up so many times. We can so often think to ourselves, how can God use us? We're just a small church in the middle of Essex. What can God do with us? And yet, here's this man who, with all of his mistakes, all of his faults, was used by God. And God can use us as well, despite all of our mistakes, despite all of our faults. In Matthew 16, verse 22 and 23, Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Obviously, hopefully, he's not going to say that to us, but can you imagine Peter, this disciple of Jesus, being called Satan? Another place where we see Peter muck up is in the Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew chapter 26. And I was reading that this week, and I came across something quite interesting. It's always quite interesting when you sort of read Bible scriptures that you know and that you've read and read, and yet you see something that you've never seen before. So here in the Garden of Gethsemane, we have Jesus gone along with the 11 disciples, because obviously Judas Iscariot has gone off at this point, and Jesus goes off to pray. And we know the story. Jesus comes back and the disciples are sleeping. But in verse 40, it says, then he, Jesus, returned to the disciples and found them asleep. He said to Peter, not he said to the group of them, he said to James and John and all the others, just he said to Peter, couldn't you watch with me even 1 hour? And it's like, so often we read that and we just assume that Jesus is talking to all the 11 disciples, and yet here in Matthew, it specifically just says Peter. And so for me, that shows that this simple fisherman from the Sea of Galilee had a special relationship with Jesus. The fact that Jesus spoke to him and rebuked him specifically, Jesus had maybe higher expectations of Peter. And of course, shortly after that, we see Peter denying Jesus 3 times. And so this great man of the church had so many faults. And when we think about ourselves, we can think so often, I can't do this because of this in my life, or I'm not a good person. And yet Peter shows us and proves to us that no matter where we are, no matter what we've done, God can use us. And as we move into the book of Acts, we can see how God starts to use Peter. In Acts chapter 2, at the start of Acts chapter 2, we have this image of the disciples all being gathered in one place, hiding. Just a few weeks earlier, Jesus has been killed on the cross, and the church has kind of gone underground. They're hiding, they're fleeing for their lives. And yet on the day of Pentecost, we see that the Holy Spirit comes, and all of a sudden these disciples who've been hiding, who've been quiet, suddenly start proclaiming the good news. And in fact, they start proclaiming it so loud that everyone around them can hear them. And we have this image of the people from Jerusalem coming to find out what all this noise is. And then it says that Peter started shouting to the crowd to tell them what was happening. This guy who just a few weeks previously had denied Jesus, had turned his back on Jesus, so to speak, suddenly starts proclaiming Jesus in front of a huge crowd. And at the end of that, we see that 3,000 people come to faith that day. And yet, as we read through Acts, we can see that as the church starts to grow, as the church starts to move out, then oppression comes. And that's what we need to face as we start thinking about taking our church out, as we start thinking about spreading the good news and telling people around us. We have to face up to the reality that we are going to face oppression. In Acts chapter 12, verses 1 to 4. About that time, King Herod Agrippa began to persecute some of the believers in the church. He had the apostle James, John's brother, killed with a sword. When he saw how much this pleased the Jewish people, he also arrested Peter. This took place during the Passover celebration, very much like Jesus. Then he imprisoned him, placing him under the guard of 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring Peter out for public trial after the Passover. So Peter was going around taking church out to the people, and then he gets arrested. It says he had 4 squads of 4 soldiers, 16 soldiers to guard 1 man. You know, it's almost as though he was deemed dangerous, you know, a psycho killer or whatever the equivalent would be today. So when Peter wrote his book, his first book of Peter, we know that Peter had personally experienced oppression. So when he was writing to the early Christians who had been scattered, who had fled because they were being persecuted, Peter knew what he was talking about. And yet one thing that Peter says time and time again about oppression is to be glad, to be happy, to rejoice. For Peter, being oppressed wasn't all doom and gloom. It was confirmation that he was doing God's will, that he was doing the work, the ministry that God had set him up to do, and that he was coming against the devil, because the devil didn't like and doesn't like what Peter was doing or what we will be doing. If we look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 to 7. So be truly glad. You know, be happy that you're being persecuted and that you're being oppressed. There is wonderful joy ahead, even though you have to endure many trials for a little while. These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It is being tested as fire tests and purifies gold. Though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world. Peter's telling us to be happy, because even though we're facing these trials, even though we're facing oppression and difficulties, we have a great reward waiting for us. But Peter also says that this testing, this oppression, is also like us being refined by gold. You know, when you try and make something made out of gold, you need to get rid of the impurities in it. The impurities can damage something. They can make it less valuable. So quite often, you'll see the blacksmith putting the gold into the hot flame to get rid of the impurities. And it's sort of just worthwhile thinking, you know, what sort of impurities might we have in our life? What sort of things do we have in our life that prevent us from being perfect? And it's something which, again, I've been thinking a lot about recently, following on from listening to the seminars. And, you know, just having this image in my mind, you know, we have that passage in the Bible where Jesus says, you know, knock and I will open up the door for you. And it's just this realization that, yes, when Jesus opens the door, we still physically have to walk into the door. And, you know, sometimes if we've got impurities in our life, if we've got something wrong in our life, it can be like a chain holding us back. We try and enter into the door, but we can't get forward because we're being held back. So what impurities do we have in our life that prevent us from entering into God's promises? It's got a little story as well about refining. It's in a book I got a few years ago. Let's find it. Some women met to study the Bible. While reading the 3rd chapter of Malachi, they came upon a remarkable expression in the 3rd verse. He will sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. One lady decided to visit the silversmith and report to the others on what he said about the subject. She went accordingly, and without telling him the reason for her visit, begged the silversmith to tell her about the process of refining silver. After he had fully described it to her, she asked, "Sir, do you sit while the work of refining is going on?" "Oh, yes, ma'am," replied the silversmith. I must sit and watch the furnace constantly, for if the time necessary for refining is exceeded in the slightest degree, the silver will be injured. The lady at once saw the beauty and comfort of the expression, he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. God sees it necessary to put his children into the furnace, but his eye is steadily intent on the work of purifying, and his wisdom and love are both engaged in the best manner for us. Our trials do not come at random, and he will not let us be tested beyond what we can endure. Before she left, the lady asked one final question. How do you know when the process is complete? The silversmith replied, that's quite simple. When I can see my own image in the silver, the refining process is complete. You know, we may go through trials and tribulations, but God is refining us to be like his image, to be like him. Back in Genesis, we're told that God made man in his image, but since the fall of man, we haven't had that perfection. And yet God, like a refiner, tests us and helps us to get rid of the impurities, to be made in his image again. Moving on to 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 13 to 17. Again, we see Peter telling us that we should be happy about being persecuted, about being oppressed. Now, who will want to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you suffer for doing what is right, God will reward you for it. So don't worry or be afraid about their threats. You know, we'll be oppressed, we'll be harmed, we'll be tortured or whatever it may be, but God will reward us. And so we shouldn't worry. You know, thinking back to the reading that Jen said this morning from Psalm 121, where does my help come from? It comes from God. Yeah. In verse 15, instead, you must worship Christ as the Lord of your life. And if someone asks you about your Christian hope, always be ready to explain it. You know, Rob's challenging us to go out, take the church out of the building. And here Peter's talking about, you know, people ask you about your Christian faith. Don't be afraid to speak to them. Be prepared to give an answer. And yet there's something else that phrase suggests. You know, if someone asks about your Christian hope, well, that implies that people know that we are Christians, that people can see Jesus reflected in our lives. Do we reflect Jesus in our lives? Through our words and through our actions. You know, Galatians 5:22 and 23, the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Are they reflected in our life? Finally, in 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 to 14, again, Peter tells us to be happy about being oppressed. It says, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you are going through, as if something strange were happening to you. You know, we need to expect that we're going to go through trials. It shouldn't be a surprise to us. We know that we're coming up against Satan, that he doesn't like what we're doing, and that he will try to do whatever he can to derail us. Verse 13, instead, be very glad, for these trials make you partners with Christ in his suffering, so that you will have the wonderful joy of seeing his glory when it is revealed to all the world. So be happy when you are insulted for being a Christian, for then the glorious Spirit of God rests on you. Be glad, be happy when we are being persecuted, when we are being oppressed, when we are insulted for our faith. Acts 16 verse 25, we have this image, this story of Paul and Silas who've been put into prison for their faith. And it's the night before they're going to be on trial. And so they're in the cell and it's all doom and gloom and they're all, why, Lord, is this happening? No. It says around midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God. Here we have these two men who think that, or who know that for some reason they could be killed in a matter of hours, and yet they are singing hymns to God. They are praising God. But then we read on the second half of that verse. The other prisoners were listening. Even in the midst of adversity and troubles, those around us look at us. They look to see what we are doing, how we are reacting, how we are coping. So even when we are facing struggles, if we can reflect Jesus in our lives, that can have a positive impact on the people around us. How can you be so happy with all this going on in your life? It's countercultural. People don't understand it, and it draws them in. God calls us to do great things for him. We shouldn't think, God can't use me because of this or because of that. Peter was a simple fisherman from the middle of nowhere. And as we've seen, he mucked up on so many levels, on so many occasions. And yet God still used him to start the church, to start the global church. As we move out in faith, we should expect oppression. The devil isn't happy with us. Peter tells us that we should rejoice and be happy when we are oppressed, when we are facing troubles, because it's a confirmation that we are doing what God wants us to do. We should be glad, we should rejoice. The end of 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 19, Peter says, if you are suffering in a manner that pleases God, keep on doing what is right and trust your lives to God who created you, for he will never fail you. Even in times of trouble, God is with us.